Thank you so much for talking to us. This is a slightly peculiar, unusual way of doing an interview.
Behind the gilded walls of Buckingham Palace, a document has emerged that could reshape the royal family forever. King Charles has just uncovered a hidden clause in his mother's will, one that directly concerns Prince Harry's inheritance. What the late Queen left behind has stunned the monarchy to its core. The discovery. The morning of November 23, 2025 began like any other in the private offices of Buckingham Palace. King Charles sat at the same mahogany desk where his mother had once conducted her most sensitive business, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and the weight of centuries of royal tradition. But what unfolded in that room over the next hour would send shockwaves through the House of Windsor in ways no one could have anticipated. Charles had requested a comprehensive review of his mother's estate documents. More than 3 years had passed since Queen Elizabeth's demise in September 2022, and certain legal formalities required periodic attention. His Majesty's senior legal counsel, accompanied by the Keeper of the Privy Purse and 2 trusted advisors, had assembled what they believed to be a routine briefing. The king, dressed in his customary dark suit, his reading glasses perched on his nose, prepared himself for what he assumed would be tedious but necessary administrative work. The leather portfolio containing the relevant documents made a soft sound as it opened on the desk. Page after page detailed the distribution of assets, properties, and heirlooms, exactly as Charles had understood them to be. The main provisions of the will had been executed according to protocol. Balmoral, Sandringham, the private jewelry collection, all had been allocated and transferred as expected. Charles had seen these documents before, or so he thought. Charles's hands, weathered but steady, broke the seal. The paper inside was in his mother's own hand, her distinctive script immediately recognizable. But this was not the flowing penmanship of her younger years. This was the writing of her final months, slightly shakier but no less deliberate. The date at the top read March 15, 2022, just 6 months before her death. His breath caught as he began to read. The room fell into absolute silence. His advisors watched as their king's expression shifted from curiosity to surprise, then to something more complex. A mixture of emotions played across features that had learned long ago to remain composed in public. But this was not a public moment. This was a son reading his mother's final thoughts about his other son, the one who had left, the one whose absence had carved a wound through the family that refused to heal. The document before him contained a clause, meticulously detailed and legally binding, that addressed Prince Harry's inheritance in ways that contradicted everything Charles had understood about his mother's final wishes. Or perhaps more accurately, it revealed wishes she had deliberately kept hidden until this precise moment. The Queen, even in death, was still playing the long game, still thinking moves ahead, still trying to protect her family in ways they might not understand until the right time came. Charles read the passage 3 times. His legal counsel confirmed that the document was authentic, properly witnessed, and legally enforceable. There was no question of its validity. The only questions now were what to do with this information and how to proceed. Because the clause didn't simply leave Harry money or property. It contained conditions, stipulations, a framework that would require decisions, conversations, and potentially a complete reassessment of the current state of affairs between the king and his younger son. One of the advisors cleared his throat gently, breaking the silence. They needed to understand His Majesty's wishes on how to proceed. Did he want time to consider this privately? Should they begin preparing briefing documents for the relevant parties? The questions hung in the air, but Charles remained focused on his mother's words, written in her final months, as she must have known her time was growing short. Charles set the document down and removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose in a gesture of profound weariness. He thought of his mother in her study at Windsor, composing these words in secret, telling no one, sealing them away with instructions that they should remain hidden until the right moment. Had she imagined this scene? Her eldest son, now king, discovering her hidden wishes and having to decide whether to honor them? Of course she had. Elizabeth had always thought everything through. The weight of the crown suddenly felt heavier than usual. Charles had inherited his mother's throne, her responsibilities, her burdens. But he had not anticipated inheriting her unsolved family crisis wrapped in legal provisions designed to force his hand, yet that was precisely what sat before him now. A choice, or perhaps more accurately, a test. Would he honor his mother's clearly stated wishes, even if they complicated his own plans and preferences? Or would he find a way, as kings sometimes must, to interpret duty in a way that served the present rather than the past? His advisors waited. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily. Outside, London continued its daily rhythm, unaware that inside these walls a discovery had just been made that could alter the course of the House of Windsor. King Charles knew that whatever he decided at this moment, there would be no going back. His mother's hidden clause was hidden no longer, and now everyone would have to deal with the consequences. What the clause reveals. The document in Queen Elizabeth's hand specified an inheritance for Prince Harry that was both substantial and conditional, revealing a complexity to her final wishes that no one in the family had fully anticipated. The provision set aside approximately £20 million from her private estate, but the money was not simply gifted. It came wrapped in requirements that demonstrated just how carefully the late Queen had considered her grandson's future and the future of the monarchy itself. The first condition was explicit. Harry would receive full access to his inheritance only upon agreeing to maintain certain connections to the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. The Queen's language was precise. She required that he spend no fewer than 90 days per year on British soil or in Commonwealth nations, engaged in work that supported either charitable causes or initiatives that benefited communities across the realm. This was not a demand that he return to working royal duties. Elizabeth had been too pragmatic for that, but it was a requirement that he remain meaningfully connected to the world she had spent 7 decades serving. The second provision addressed Harry's children, Archie and Lilibet. A portion of the inheritance, approximately £5 million, was designated specifically for their education and upbringing, but with stipulations. The funds were to be managed by trustees approved by both Harry and the reigning monarch, ensuring that Charles would have some oversight. More significantly, the Queen specified that the children should spend meaningful time in the United Kingdom as they grew older, with the stated purpose of maintaining their connection to their heritage and their family. She had written that her great-grandchildren should not become strangers to the land of their ancestors. Perhaps most telling was a personal letter, attached to the legal document, written in the Queen's hand. It was addressed to Charles, intended to be read when the clause was discovered. In it, she acknowledged the difficulty of the situation with Harry. She wrote that she understood the anger, the hurt, the sense of betrayal that many in the family felt. But she also wrote something that cut to the heart of a mother's and grandmother's perspective. She stated that Harry was still her grandson, that his children were still her great-grandchildren, and that she could not leave this earth without trying one more time to ensure they would not be lost to the family completely. The letter to Charles contained a request, phrased not as a command, but as the hope of a dying mother. She asked him to consider that bridges, once burned, can sometimes be rebuilt, but only if both sides are willing to supply the materials. Her inheritance clause, she explained, was her attempt to supply those materials. What Charles and Harry chose to build with them would be up to them. But she wanted them to have the resources, both financial and emotional, to try. The legal team had confirmed that the clause was ironclad. The Queen had consulted with her most trusted legal minds in drafting it. Every word had been carefully chosen to withstand scrutiny and to make her intentions crystal clear. This was not a suggestion that could be easily dismissed or reinterpreted. This was the will of a queen, and more than that, the will of a mother and grandmother who had run out of time to fix things herself, but refused to give up trying even in death. The amount of money involved was significant but not overwhelming by royal standards. Elizabeth had been shrewd enough to know that too large a sum might create its own problems, might make Harry seem like he was being bought, or might fuel media narratives about special treatment. £20 million was enough to provide genuine security and opportunity, but not so much that it would overshadow the deeper purpose of the provision, which was not about money at all, but about connection, about family, about not letting the bonds break completely. Reading through the document, Charles could almost hear his mother's voice. The phrasing was hers, practical yet emotional, firm yet hopeful. She had known she was dying. She had known that the Harry situation would become Charles's problem to solve, And so she had left him this, a tool perhaps, or a burden, or maybe both. A hidden clause in her will that was really a hidden plea, a final attempt to keep her family whole, even as she prepared to leave it behind. The Queen's intentions. To understand why Queen Elizabeth included this hidden clause in her will requires looking back at the evolution of her relationship with Prince Harry, particularly during the tumultuous years following his departure from royal duties. The Queen had always had a special affection for Harry, something that those close to the royal family had observed since he was a child. He made her laugh. He was irreverent in ways that reminded some of her own youth, before duty had calcified every spontaneous impulse into protocol. The decision by Harry and Meghan to step back from royal life in January 2020 had blindsided the Queen. Sources close to the palace at the time described her as hurt and disappointed, not because Harry wanted a different life, but because of how the announcement had been made without proper consultation, forcing the institution into a reactive position. Yet even in that hurt, those who knew her best said that Elizabeth's primary concern was for Harry's well-being and his future security. The Oprah interview on March 2021 had been more difficult. Allegations about racism within the family, claims about lack of support during Meghan's mental health crisis, the suggestion that the institution had been cold and uncaring, all of this had wounded the Queen. She was the institution in many ways, and criticisms of it felt personal. Her public response had been measured and had included the now famous phrase that recollections may vary, a diplomatic way of suggesting that there were multiple perspectives on the events Harry and Meghan described. But privately, friends of the Queen indicated that she was deeply troubled by the breakdown in family relationships. What many people did not fully appreciate was that throughout this period, the Queen had maintained private channels of communication with Harry. They spoke on the phone, not frequently but regularly enough that the connection was not completely severed. She made it clear to him, in ways that only a grandmother can, that she loved him regardless of the choices he had made. She did not agree with all of his decisions. She did not appreciate the public nature of the family disputes, but he was still her grandson, and that bond, to her, was not something that palace politics could fully break. In her final year, Elizabeth's health declined noticeably. Those around her saw a woman coming to terms with her mortality, quietly arranging her affairs, making peace with what she would leave undone. The Harry situation sat high on that list of unfinished business. She had successfully navigated so much during her 70-year reign. She had modernized the monarchy in crucial ways while preserving its essential character. She had held the Commonwealth together through decades of change, but she could not solve the rift in her own family, and that failure haunted her. The drafting of the hidden clause appears to have occurred during a period in late 2021 and early 2022 when several factors converged. The Queen's health was declining. Harry and Meghan had settled in California and seemed unlikely to return to any form of royal duty. The Jubilee celebrations were approaching, and there was uncertainty about whether Harry would attend. In this context, Elizabeth seems to have decided that she needed to take action, not through public gestures or family meetings, which had failed, but through the one tool she still fully controlled, her will. She consulted with her most trusted legal advisor, a man who had served her for decades and understood both the legal complexities and the family dynamics. Together, they crafted language that would achieve her goals. She wanted to provide for Harry's financial security, removing that as a source of stress or potential embarrassment. She wanted to ensure that his children would not grow up completely disconnected from their British heritage. And crucially, she wanted to create a framework that would require Charles and Harry to communicate, to negotiate, to work together on implementing the terms of the provision. The decision to keep the clause hidden until after a comprehensive estate review was deliberate. Elizabeth did not want this to become part of the immediate post-death narrative. She did not want it leaked to the press or used as a tool in the early days of Charles's reign, when he would be establishing his authority. She wanted time to pass, for emotions to settle somewhat, for the acute phase of grief and transition to give way to something more stable. Only then, she reasoned, would her provision have the best chance of being received in the spirit she intended. In the personal letter she attached to the clause, Elizabeth had written something that revealed the depth of her thinking. She acknowledged that she had failed to keep her family together during her lifetime. She wrote that she had perhaps waited too long to intervene forcefully, that she had trusted too much in the idea that family members would eventually come to their senses and reconcile on their own. By the time she fully understood how deep the rifts had become, her health and the protocols surrounding her position made certain interventions impossible. What emerges from understanding the Queen's intentions is a portrait of a woman who loved deeply, who felt the fracturing of her family as a personal failure, and who refused to simply accept that failure as permanent. She had seen so much in her long life, had weathered so many storms, and she believed fundamentally that family bonds, when truly tested, should be able to withstand even the most serious disagreements. Her hidden clause was an expression of that belief, a final attempt to ensure that the test would not result in permanent separation. Charles's dilemma. Sitting in his private office, the document still in his hands, King Charles faced a dilemma that was both profoundly personal and deeply constitutional. The personal dimension was obvious. This was his mother's dying wish regarding his son, the child he had loved, worried about, and yes, been angered and disappointed by. But the constitutional dimension was equally significant. As king, Charles's decisions carried weight that extended far beyond family dynamics. Whatever he chose to do with this information would send signals about his reign, his priorities, and his vision for the monarchy's future. His relationship with Harry had deteriorated significantly since the move to California. The public accusations, the Netflix documentary, Harry's memoir with its harsh criticisms of Charles as a father and as a future king, all of this had wounded him deeply. Charles had spent his entire life preparing to be king, and part of that preparation involved developing a thick skin for criticism. But criticism from your own son, broadcast to the world, cuts through even the thickest skin. The anger Charles felt was real, and it coexisted with the love he still had for Harry in ways that created constant internal tension. William's reaction would also matter significantly. The Prince of Wales had been even more unforgiving than his father regarding Harry's departure and subsequent public comments. The relationship between the brothers, once so close, had fractured perhaps beyond repair. William viewed Harry's actions as betrayals not just of the family but of the institution, of the monarchy itself. He had advised his father to take a firm line, to make clear that there were consequences for Harry's choices. The discovery of the Queen's hidden provision would complicate William's position and potentially create friction between Charles and his heir. Charles arranged a private meeting with William for the following day. The conversation would be difficult. He needed to inform his eldest son about the clause before any decisions were made about how to proceed. William had a right to know, and more pragmatically, Charles needed his support, or at least his understanding. If the King and the Prince of Wales were publicly at odds over how to handle Harry, it would create exactly the kind of family drama that weakened the monarchy and fed the press for months. The meeting took place in Charles's private sitting room. William arrived alone, sensing from his father's tone that this was serious. When Charles explained what had been discovered, William's face darkened. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening as the details emerged. When Charles finished, William's response was immediate and sharp. Grandmother had overstepped. She had no right to bind the family to conditions that would require reconciliation with someone who had repeatedly attacked them. The money was one thing, but requiring Harry to spend time in the UK, giving him and his father oversight of how Harry's children were raised, this was manipulation from beyond the grave. Charles let his son vent. He understood the anger. He even shared some of it. But he also knew his mother well enough to understand her motivations, and he felt the weight of obligation that came with being her son and her successor. She had asked him as directly as a queen and mother could to give Harry another chance, to use her final gift as an opportunity for healing. Could he simply refuse? Should he? The question was not as simple as William seemed to think. The conversation with William lasted over an hour. No consensus was reached. William made his position clear. If Charles chose to honor this provision in full, to reach out to Harry and offer him this inheritance with all its conditions, then William would not stand in the way, but neither would he participate. He would not pretend that Harry's return to spending significant time in the UK was something he welcomed. He would be civil if required, but he would not go beyond that. The wounds were too deep, the trust too broken. Charles could play the forgiving father if he wished. William would remain the protective older brother who had not forgotten the pain Harry had caused Catherine and their children. Beyond the family dynamics, Charles also had to consider the broader implications for the monarchy. Public opinion on Harry was divided. Some saw him as a victim of an outdated institution, a man who had chosen love and mental health over duty and tradition. Others saw him as spoiled, ungrateful, willing to exploit his royal connection for commercial gain while simultaneously attacking the family that had given him everything. How the public would react to news of a substantial inheritance with conditions that seemed designed to lure Harry back was unpredictable. It could be seen as compassionate and family-oriented, or it could be seen as weakness, as the monarchy allowing itself to be held hostage by someone who had already taken so much and given so little in return. Charles's advisors were split. The older generation, those who had served his mother, tended to counsel honoring her wishes fully and immediately. They spoke of duty, of respecting the dead, of the importance of family unity. The younger advisors, those who thought more in terms of public relations and modern monarchy, were more cautious. They worried about setting precedents, about seeming to reward bad behavior, about the optics of Charles appearing to be controlled by his mother's will even in death. In the quiet hours late that night, Charles sat alone in his study. He thought about his mother, about the countless times she had guided him, advised him, sometimes overruled him. She had been the constant in his life, the North Star by which he had navigated decades of preparation for the role he now held. She had not been perfect, she had made mistakes, but her love for her family had never been in question, and her dedication to the institution of monarchy had been absolute. This clause was her final piece of guidance, her last bit of advice, delivered from beyond death. Could he ignore it? More importantly, should he? The dilemma Charles faced was ultimately about what kind of king he wanted to be, what kind of father he wanted to be remembered as, and whether those two identities could coexist in this moment. His mother had tried to give him a path forward, but walking it would require courage, forgiveness, and a willingness to risk further pain if Harry rejected the olive branch or accepted it but failed to live up to the conditions. The discovery of the hidden clause had not provided answers. It had only made the questions more urgent and the stakes impossibly high. Harry's position. 3,000 miles away in Montecito, Prince Harry had no idea that his grandmother's will contained a provision specifically designed for him, or that his father had just discovered it and was wrestling with what to do next. Harry's life in California had settled into a rhythm that was both dramatically different from his royal existence and in some ways surprisingly similar in its demands and pressures. The Netflix projects, the memoir, the speaking engagements all required a level of public performance that was not so different from royal duties, just with different masters and different protocols. Financially, Harry and Meghan were secure but not as wealthy as many assumed. The Netflix and Spotify deals had provided substantial sums, but maintaining their lifestyle, security costs, and funding their various charitable initiatives required ongoing income. Harry had been born into wealth, but had not inherited the kind of generational fortune that would allow him to simply live off investments. He needed to work, to generate revenue, which meant continuing to navigate the complex relationship between his royal past and his commercial present. The relationship with his father remained strained. They had spoken occasionally, brief conversations usually centered on logistics around the children or unavoidable family events. Charles had attended his coronation, but the visit had been brief and the interactions minimal. Harry had offered condolences and support during his father's cancer diagnosis earlier in 2024, but the response had been polite rather than warm. The wall between them was high and seemed to grow higher with each passing month of silence and distance. But the conditions attached to the inheritance would create immediate friction. Spending 90 days per year in the UK or Commonwealth countries was not a small ask. It would mean significant time away from the life he and Meghan had built in California. It would mean exposure to the British press, to the very environment they had left, specifically because of its toxicity and the damage it had done to their mental health. Meghan's willingness to return regularly to the UK was doubtful at best. She had made clear that she felt unsafe there, that the racism and harassment she experienced had been traumatic. Asking her to agree to regular returns would test their marriage in ways that Harry might not be willing to risk. The provision about his children would be even more sensitive. Harry and Meghan had been fiercely protective of Archie and Lilibet, keeping them largely out of the public eye, raising them in California with American values and perspectives. The idea of trustees approved by King Charles having oversight of funds for their education and upbringing would feel like an intrusion, a way for the palace to maintain control even across an ocean. The requirement that the children spend meaningful time in the UK as they grew older would raise questions about what that meant, how it would be enforced, who would decide what constituted meaningful connection to their heritage. Yet Harry might also see in his grandmother's provision something that he had been searching for, evidence that he had not been completely cut off, that there was still family on the other side of the divide who wanted connection rather than estrangement. His relationship with the Queen had remained special even through the worst of the conflicts. She had been a source of stability and unconditional love in ways that other family members had not. Learning that she had spent her final months trying to engineer a way back for him might pierce through the defensive armor he had built up over years of conflict and public battle. Meghan's influence on Harry's decision would be significant. She had been the catalyst, or at least the catalyst that finally gave him courage to leave royal life. Her perspective on the family was shaped by her own negative experiences, by feeling unsupported and targeted. She had built a new life for them in America, had created opportunities and connections that would be jeopardized by regular returns to the UK. Her voice in this decision would be powerful, and it was far from clear which way she would lean. There was also the matter of Harry's children and what he owed them. Did he have the right to cut them off completely from their British heritage, from their royal family, from the possibility of relationships with their grandfather, their uncle, their cousins? As Archie and Lilibet grew older, would they resent having been kept away, having been denied the chance to know that side of their family? The Queen's provision seemed designed to prevent that, to ensure that even if the adult relationships remained fractured, the children would have opportunities to forge their own connections. What seemed certain was that Harry could not remain unchanged by his grandmother's final message to him. Learning that she had spent her last months thinking about him, worrying about his future, trying to build a bridge that might survive her death, would force him to reckon with complicated emotions. Love, guilt, anger, gratitude, suspicion, hope all would compete for dominance as he tried to decide how to respond to this unexpected gift from beyond the grave. The path forward. Charles's advisors recommended a hybrid approach. A formal legal notification would be sent through proper channels, informing Harry of the inheritance, its conditions, and the process for claiming it. Simultaneously, Charles would write a personal letter, brief and measured, acknowledging the discovery of his mother's provision and expressing his intention to honor her wishes. The letter would not plead or demand, but it would open a door, create space for conversation if Harry chose to walk through it. The timeline for Harry's response would be important. The legal documents would specify a period, likely 90 days, during which Harry could formally accept or reject the terms of the inheritance. Acceptance would trigger a series of legal and practical steps. Trustees would need to be appointed. Frameworks for monitoring compliance with the conditions would need to be established. Mechanisms for the children's funds would need to be set up. All of this would require communication between Harry's representatives and the palace, creating interactions that had been minimal in recent years. Rejection would be simpler in some ways, more complicated in others. If Harry formally rejected the inheritance, the funds would revert to the general estate and be distributed according to the will's other provisions. But the public relations implications of such a rejection would be significant. Harry would be seen as either principled, unwilling to accept conditions on his autonomy, or as ungrateful, turning down his grandmother's dying gift because it came with strings attached. The narrative would be fought over in the press for months. The most likely scenario, however, might be neither immediate acceptance nor rejection, but negotiation. Harry's lawyers would likely seek modifications to the conditions, arguing that they were too restrictive or impractical. Perhaps the 90 days per year could be reduced to 60, or the requirement could be spread across multiple years rather than annual. Perhaps the trustee arrangement for the children's funds could be modified to give Harry and Meghan more control. The Queen had been thorough in her drafting. But even the tightest legal language leaves room for interpretation and discussion. For King Charles, these negotiations would be a test. How much would he bend to accommodate Harry's concerns? How much would he insist on honoring the letter of his mother's wishes? Finding the right balance would require wisdom that went beyond legal or political calculation. It would require understanding his son, understanding what might genuinely bring him back versus what might push him further away. Charles had decades of experience in negotiation and diplomacy, but those skills had never been tested in circumstances this personal and this painful. The potential impact on other royals, particularly William's children George, Charlotte, and Louis, added another layer of complexity. They were Harry's niece and nephews, family connections that should have been nurtured, but had instead withered in the climate of adult conflict. If Harry began spending significant time in the UK again, would there be opportunities for these cousins to develop relationships? Would William allow it, or would he continue to keep distance between his children and their uncle? The Queen's vision seemed to include mending these generational rifts, but implementation would depend on cooperation from multiple family members, not all of whom shared her conciliatory instincts. But the more realistic scenario might be something messier and more partial. Harry might accept the money but resist fully embracing the spirit of the conditions. He might meet the technical requirements while maintaining emotional distance, spending his obligatory time in the UK or Commonwealth, but avoiding deeper family engagement. The relationships might remain cordial but cool, functional but not warm. This would be a kind of reconciliation, but not the healing transformation the Queen had hoped for when she drafted her hidden clause. The worst-case scenario would be one where the inheritance became another flashpoint for conflict. Harry might accept it, but then publicly complain about the conditions, turning his grandmother's gift into evidence of ongoing family control and manipulation. The media would feast on such a narrative, and the resulting coverage would damage both Harry and the monarchy. Charles would be portrayed as either weak for trying to buy back his son's loyalty, or cruel for attaching conditions to what should have been unconditional familial support. The Queen's final attempt at peacemaking would be transformed into its opposite, another weapon in the ongoing war. The path forward was unclear, fraught with emotional landmines and practical obstacles, but it was a path, which was more than the family had before. Queen Elizabeth, even in death, had given them something to work with, a framework within which reconciliation might be possible if everyone involved was willing to try. Whether they would prove willing remained the great unanswered question. But for the first time in years, there was at least a map, drawn by a grandmother's hand, that showed a way back from estrangement towards something that might eventually, possibly, resemble family again. The hidden clause in Queen Elizabeth's will had emerged from secrecy into the harsh light of reality. King Charles held in his hands both a burden and an opportunity, a final test from his mother and a final gift. What he and Harry chose to do with it would shape not just their relationship, but the future of the monarchy itself. The clock was ticking. Decisions would need to be made. And across the distance that separated London from California, a family's fate hung in the balance, suspended between the past's pain and the uncertain possibilities of whatever came next.